In part 10 of this introduction to standardized echography, we will raise and answer the question: should in a particular case be standardized A scan used or B scan, or maybe both? There is an analogy. The B scan is like pictures, whereas the A scan is like a written text. This is Snoopy, the dog, obviously sleeping here on the roof of his doghouse. What the picture else shows is not relevant to the question what happened. Obviously he was awakened, but why? That the bushes are green, not snow-covered, and it is maybe summer, that the sky is blue, no rain clouds, and that the doghouse is brown, that all doesn't matter to answer the question, what is going on with Snoopy? Echography, the situation is similar. The echographic B-scan picture shows many details that are not needed for the diagnosis and obviously clear, such as that the eye is being examined and so on. The question always remains, what is the diagnosis in this case? And that often remains, at least in part, a question with the B-scan picture. And here is the answer to the question about Snoopy. I can't sleep like that. All the blood rushes to my nose. I must therefore lie on my back. This answer comes from the written text, and honestly, would you have guessed that just from the pictures? I'm sure there would be as many different answers to the question what happened to Snoopy as there are readers of these texts. A similar situation is with echography. The B-scan gives a lot of details that are not really needed to make a diagnosis or have nothing to do with the diagnosis. And so many times the A-scan writing is necessary to clarify the situation and come up with the final diagnosis. But both A-scan and B-scan should be used in combination. They have different roles, and therefore each modality should be used for what it serves best. The combined effort will provide 100% of the important or needed diagnostic information. Rarely one of the two modalities alone is sufficient to come up with the 100%. Most of the time a combination is required. B-scan echograms from infantile glaucoma. The right eye, this is a transverse section of the 3 o'clock posteriorly. Left eye, a longitudinal section of the 9 o'clock posteriorly. For the specific diagnosis, B-scan was enough, showing the large excavation of the optic discs in both eyes, and that there was nothing going on in the posterior segment otherwise. Here we see reduced sensitivity settings, and the question is which settings are best for the diagnosis, the top ones or the low ones with the reduced gains. It's the bottom ones. They show more detail for the specific diagnosis, better display of the depth and the width of the excavation. Certainly the top ones are more appreciable and more beautiful, but they contain the blooming effect that narrows the excavations and make them appear shallower than they are. Or here in the subluxated lens, it's the B-scan that gives us the answer. This lens is subluxated. We see here the corneal surfaces, anterior chamber, pupil, and the lens not in place. That is with a simple 10 MHz B-scan. This is kinetic echography of the subluxated lens using B-scan first, and you see the shakiness of this subluxated lens after each eye movement, and a little bit the after movements of the iris. That was obtained with a 10 MHz B-scan. That's the immersion fluid, cornea, anterior chamber, pupil. And one can see here the one sonnular fiber that is still holding the lens in place, or somewhat in place. The lens is cataractous. With a smaller horizontal expansion, we see the posterior pole too, with the palms bumps, but the better visibility of the after movements is with the larger expansion. And now let's look at the A-scan too. The A-scan here, fluid, cornea, anterior chamber, iris, lens. When the distance of the probe is changed, the reverberation signals move twice as fast. And then watch the iris, the trembling after movements of the iris, not caused by an eye movement, but in the fixated direction of the gaze. Let's look at this one more time to be able to watch the details better. The after movements of the lens is caused by the eye movement, and that is typical for kinetic echography. With the B-scan, it requires an eye movement to cause after movements. With A-scan, it's different. The eye is not moved voluntarily, but the minimal, unintentional correctional eye movements that occur are enough to produce the after movements in the A-scan. And here again, the A-scan, watch the iris, the peak of the iris, that shows this brief trembling after movements when the probe is not moved. Here you can see it, especially at reduced system sensitivity. What diagnostically important echographic information is provided by the standardized A-scan, and what is provided by the B-scan? Standard A-scan provides about 80% of all important and needed echographic information, B-scan only 20%. Why is this? Both A-scan and B-scan use the same two-dimensional screen, but B-scan uses it up by showing a two-dimensional picture of the eye and the lesion, whereas the A-scan only uses one dimension at any given time, so that the second dimension of the screen display is available to show the amplitudes and changes in the amplitudes that in B-scan only is expressed by different brightness of the individual echo signals. And here a clinical example of an intraocular tumor, a transverse scan of the B-scan and a longitudinal scan, showing the topography very well and the shape, whereas the A-scan at tissue sensitivity gives the diagnosis of a choroidal malignant melanoma, which cannot be obtained with a B-scan unless the tumor has a mushroom shape, which is rarely the case. At measuring sensitivity, the A-scan provides the precise maximal height of the tumor that can only be measured roughly, not as precisely with the B-scan. Let's look at another difference between brightness modulated B-scan and amplitude modulated A-scan. Independence of the screen brightness used. When we have a bright picture in B-scan, we see here a complete display of a retinal detachment. When we dim the brightness, we lose information. And that is the same system gain that we used. On A-scan, by contrast, when we use a high brightness of the screen or a dimmed screen, it's the same information, the same amplitudes of the echo spikes. Two B-scan echograms that show a large folded surface. Is it retinal detachment? This one was, but how do we know for sure? When we look at this, we see similar situation where the beam hits perpendicular, we get a bright spot. Here even so strong that the beam width causes lines of these points, and in between where the beam hits this surface that is very smooth, obliquely we get total reflection and thus shadows. We see the shadows here too. We need the E-scan to clearly differentiate this. It's tissue sensitivity, no way that this could be a retinal signal. It's way too weak. On this side, it's a clear-cut retinal signal, 100% high spike, sharply rising, and the A1 is highly positive. So we need sometimes the E-scan information to add to the B-scan and come to a clear-cut final diagnosis. These two E-scans were obtained with tissue sensitivity. Another B-scan that raises questions: is that a subluxated lens? Now in B-scan, when we're careful, we can answer that. No, it's not a subluxated lens because the lens is here when you go axially. So what is it then? A tumor. But what kind of tumor? The E-scan gives the answer. That is clearly a malignant melanoma. With standardized E-scan, this sclera at the base of a malignant melanoma can be evaluated regarding the presence or absence of massive scleral infiltration. On the left, we see an intact sclera behind the tumor. There's a condensation of the choroid that was infiltrated by the tumor, and this is a surface that sometimes produces an extra medium-high signal in front of the scleral signal. But the sclera here is intact. By contrast, on the right side we see massive scleral infiltration. The sclera is also thinned. The intact scleral spike looks like this, rising from the low reflective tumor signals, a high spike with a number of high frequency oscillations because it's a coarse surface, but in this case intact, whereas here we see what happens with massive scleral infiltration. It's not one spike that rises up, it's several spikes getting higher and higher. A retrobulbar tumor that surrounds the optic nerve. Here a transverse scan at 12 o'clock. Here the longitudinal scan, it shows the tumor goes far anterior episclerally. There is the optic nerve. On A scan, we see the tumor has a low reflectivity at tissue sensitivity. That's the ocular wall here, it's episclerally, and that is a lymphoid hyperplasia in this case. That should be differentiated from a malignant lymphoma through a biopsy. Here with an ocular expansion showing the ocular wall more clearly. Retina, inner sclera, outer sclera, and here's the tumor. But from B scan we couldn't tell the kind of tumor that was. Nor can we see on B scan the retina and sclera separated that well. Or another case, the B scan clearly shows the long section and cross section of a dilated superior orbital vein. So there's a suspicion that this is an AV fistula is there, and occasionally the B scan may show pulsations of the wall of this vessel. But it's a clear-cut diagnosis with A scan. The blood flow of the content, fast blood flow, is visible on A scan. This is, by contrast, the normal orbital A scan surrounding the AV fistula. And here we have the AV fistula in A scan kinetic echography. This young man had been referred to us with a questionable hemangioma in the right orbit. The left one is normal orbital tissue. When we place the probe here, we see immediately a large area with fast spontaneous motion. That's not a hemangioma, that is an AV fistula. Turning now to the UBM, we already said that here are cysts of the iris that we can measure with the UBM B-scan, the cysts, the size of them in any direction we desire, with greater accuracy and precision than with an A-scan. And we also can differentiate these cysts from solid tumors. But when we have a solid tumor, like here this pigmented iris tumor, there is a longitudinal section in this direction with the UBM, 50 MHz B-scan probe with the transfer section. We see it this way. But what tumor is that? The UBM B-scan shows a lot of structures in there, but there is no way to differentiate this tumor, which was a malignant melanoma, from a nevus or other tumor of the iris. Solid tumors of the anterior segment are differentiated with the standardized A-scan method. An immersion technique is used. The probe is placed from above. The beam is aimed first along the axis of the eye, resulting in this normal echogram here. Initial spike probe surface, immersion fluid, corneal surfaces, anterior chamber, anterior lens surface, lens, posterior lens surface, vitreous, fundus. These two signals are reverberation signals. Then probe and beam are slightly angled, coming from more peripheral through the area where the tumor is. And we see that here the tumor is not yet reached. The iris thickness is 0.5 millimeter, that's normal. Still full anterior chamber and the cornea. This is a reverberation signal of the cornea. Then we come already through the tumor here. That's the tumor. That's the remnant anterior chamber, cornea, and iris lens surface. And we see that the tumor has a low reflectivity consistent with a malignant melanoma of the iris. The thickness there was 1.46 millimeters. And then we go through the center of the tumor, and here the surface of the tumor, anterior, posterior, and low reflectivity again. And in this low spikes was possible to see vascularity. The tumor height was there 2.01 millimeter, but more precise measurements are obtainable with the UBM B-scan. But the differential diagnosis is made with standardized A-scan, proving that this was a malignant melanoma of the iris. And here in retropalpar lesion in these two eyes, looking very similar around the optic nerve. There's the optic nerve, expanding episclerally in both directions. And then the A-scans give us the type of lesion. That was a scleritis. That is the scleral infiltration here. The sclera is lower reflective than normal and much thicker. This is the fundus, the retina choroid, and that's the episclera. And this was a lymphoma, or a pseudolymphoma. A differentiation with the B-scan is not possible, not even a common diagnosis is possible. So standardized echography uses both A-scan and B-scan. One should use each modality for what it is known to be its strength. B-scans for topography primarily, A-scans for tissue diagnosis and measurements. And one should evaluate using echography independent of other clinical tests. Don't be influenced by the ophthalmoscopic findings, by fluorescein angiography in intraocular lesions, or by CT and MRI in the orbit. The diagnosis should be done with standardized echography independently, and then correct results will be obtained. Standardized echography is the method of choice, regardless of whether we have a complicated case of tissue differentiation or just simply ruling out a lesion in the posterior eye segment or in the orbit. At all levels of performance, standardized echography is more reliable, more effective, and more precise. Finally, a list of all the completely standardized instruments in the history of echography. The first units were handled manually. The very first unit was a CAT 7900S A and B scan for immersion techniques, 1968. The most popular unit was in the 70s the CAT 7200MA, a sole A scan. It was followed by the Sonocrats A scan in the late 70s and then replaced by the Mini A scan in the 80s. And then came the automatic A and B scan instruments that were standardized. B scan S since the year 2000, CineScan S since the year 2007, and finally since 2010 the most advanced unit, the Aviso S by Quantel Medical. The Aviso S is a portable unit. It's all digitized, and all